November 14th, 1944. 0542 hours. The Hurtgen Forest, Germany. Corporal James Kelleher crouched in a muddy foxhole 300 yards from a German observation post that killed 47 American soldiers in the past 11 days. The bunker sat embedded in the hillside like a malignant tumor, its firing slit invisible except for the muzzle flashes that preceded death. Kelleher's breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as he studied the structure through his rifle scope, searching for something everyone else had missed. Behind him, Captain Robert Hendricks whispered urgently into a field radio, coordinating another failed assault that would leave more men bleeding into the frost-covered ground. Kelleher ignored the chatter. His mind was elsewhere, calculating angles that had nothing to do with military doctrine and everything to do with the geometry lessons his father had beaten into him over a pool table in South Boston 14 years earlier. Jimmy Kelleher grew up in a 3-room apartment above Sullivan's Pool Hall on West Broadway, where cigarette smoke hung so thick you could barely see the far wall, and men gambled away their wages on felt tables that had seen better decades. His father, Thomas Kelleher, worked the docks by day and hustled pool by night, a man whose hands were equally skilled at loading cargo and reading angles. Thomas had a gift for geometry that he'd never formalized with education, but applied with ruthless precision across green felt. He could look at any shot, no matter how impossible, and find a pathway through deflection, spin, and calculated force. When Jimmy turned 8, Thomas began teaching him not just how to play pool, but how to see the world as a series of angles, trajectories, and hidden pathways. He would set up impossible shots, combinations that required the cue ball to kiss 3 rails and 2 other balls before sinking the target, then make Jimmy calculate the solution before attempting it. If Jimmy got it wrong, Thomas would tap the table with his cue stick and say the same thing every time. "Angles don't lie, boy. People do. Trust the geometry." By the time Jimmy turned 16, he could run a table against men twice his age, seeing shots that others couldn't imagine, and executing them with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. But pool halls didn't pay for much beyond rent and whiskey, and when Thomas Kelleher died of pneumonia in the winter of 1941, Jimmy found himself working the same docks his father had worked, loading Liberty ships bound for a war that hadn't yet reached American shores. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and 6 months later Jimmy stood in a recruitment office, signing papers that would send him to Camp Blanding, Florida, where drill sergeants would discover he had an unexpected talent. On the rifle range, Jimmy consistently outshot men who'd grown up hunting in rural America, not because he had better eyes or steadier hands, but because he understood something fundamental about ballistics that others treated as instinct. He saw bullet trajectories the same way he'd seen pool shots, as problems in geometry where wind, distance, gravity, and target movement were simply variables in an equation. His instructors noticed. By August 1942, Kelleher had been selected for sniper training, a specialized school where they taught men to kill from distances that made conventional infantry tactics irrelevant. Sniper doctrine in 1944 was relatively straightforward. You found a concealed position with clear sight lines of enemy personnel, calculated distance and wind, then waited for a target to present itself. You aimed for center mass, or, if you were skilled and the conditions allowed, for the head. You did not attempt shots through narrow openings. You did not try to ricochet bullets off hard surfaces. And you absolutely did not freelance techniques that hadn't been proven by generations of marksmen. The military had developed these rules through experience, and deviating from them usually got you killed. Kelleher understood the doctrine, respected it even, but his pool hall education had taught him something the military hadn't, that sometimes the impossible shot was just a geometry problem no one had bothered to solve. That mindset had served him well through North Africa and Sicily, where his confirmed kill count climbed steadily while other snipers struggled. But it wasn't until the Hurtgen Forest that Kelleher would discover a problem so complex, so seemingly impossible, that even his unconventional thinking would be tested to its absolute limit. The observation post had appeared in late October, shortly after the 28th Infantry Division pushed into the forest's nightmarish terrain. Someone with considerable engineering skill had constructed it into a natural hillside, using reinforced concrete, steel beams, and clever camouflage to create something nearly invisible and almost invulnerable. The firing slit was only 8 inches wide and positioned at an angle that made direct shots nearly impossible. Worse, The German observer inside never showed himself for more than a fraction of a second, just long enough to identify American positions before radioing artillery coordinates that would rain down minutes later with devastating accuracy. The post had a clear view of a critical supply road, meaning American convoys had to either risk exposure or take a much longer route that added hours to delivery times. Division command wanted it eliminated, but conventional options had all failed. Artillery strikes had cratered the hillside without touching the bunker. Mortar teams had exhausted their ammunition trying to drop rounds through the narrow aperture, and 3 snipers had already died attempting direct shots, their positions revealed by muzzle flash before German machine gunners cut them down. Captain Hendricks had almost given up when someone mentioned Kelleher, the corporal with a strange reputation for impossible shots. Hendricks was skeptical. He'd seen too many soldiers die because they thought they were smarter than doctrine, but desperation made men reconsider their principles. On November 13th, he pulled Kelleher aside and explained the situation. The observation post had to go silent permanently, and conventional methods weren't working. Could Kelleher find a solution? Kelleher asked for 12 hours to study the target, 300 rounds of ammunition for testing, and a promise that no one would interfere with his work. Hendricks agreed, mostly because he had no other options, and because sending one more sniper to probable death wasn't much different than the 3 he'd already lost. Kelleher spent the first 6 hours simply watching the bunker through binoculars from 4 different positions, sketching the structure in a waterproof notebook, and measuring angles with a small brass protractor he'd carried since Boston. He noted how the firing slit angled 15 degrees downward to cover the road, how the concrete walls extended 3 feet beyond the visible opening, creating a protected alcove for the observer, and how the Germans had positioned heavy timber and earth cover above to defeat plunging fire. He watched how light moved across the structure at different times of day, revealing subtle details invisible in flat illumination, and he noticed something others had missed. A narrow gap between the concrete wall and a steel I-beam that formed part of the bunker's internal support structure, visible only from one specific angle and only during a 15-minute window when the morning sun created enough contrast to distinguish metal from shadow. That gap was barely 3 inches wide and located 18 inches behind the firing slit, positioned where it would be invisible to anyone shooting from conventional sniper positions. But Kelleher's pool hall, I saw something else entirely. He saw a deflection angle. If he could place a bullet precisely on the curved inner surface of that steel beam at exactly the right angle, the projectile might deflect downward and inward, traveling through the gap and into the bunker's interior where the observer sat protected by concrete walls. It was absurd. It was a pool shot translated into ballistics, a technique that probably violated every principle in the sniper manual, and the odds of success were microscopically small. But Kelleher had seen impossible shots work before, and the geometry was speaking to him in the same language his father had taught him over green felt tables when he was 8 years old. He spent the next 6 hours calculating. The deflection angle had to account for bullet velocity, the hardness of the steel beam, the projectile's construction, and the fact that any deflected bullet would tumble unpredictably once it left the beam surface. Kelleher measured the distance at 478 yards, close enough that his rifle's muzzle velocity would still be high, but far enough that even minor errors would magnify catastrophically. He calculated wind at the target, temperature effects on barrel harmonics, and the exact aiming point on the beam's curved surface that might produce the deflection he needed. Then he did something no military doctrine would endorse. He started experimenting with different ammunition types to find one that might hold together through the deflection impact while still retaining enough energy to be lethal on the other side. Standard military ball ammunition was designed to penetrate flesh and light cover, not to bounce off hardened steel and retain trajectory. Kelleher needed something different. He scrounged through supply crates until he found several boxes of M2 armor-piercing rounds, projectiles designed to punch through vehicle plate at close range. The bullets had hardened steel cores that might survive the deflection impact without fragmenting completely. He test-fired 20 rounds into a damaged Sherman tank hull at similar angles, studying how the projectiles behaved when striking hardened metal at oblique impacts. Most fragmented uselessly, but a few deflected with enough remaining mass to be dangerous. It wasn't much, but it was something. Kelleher calculated he'd need perfect conditions, perfect positioning, and more luck than any reasonable person would bet on. But the geometry said it was possible. The angles didn't lie. People did. And Jimmy Kelleher had learned long ago to trust the mathematics, even when common sense screamed otherwise. By 05:30 on November 14th, Kelleher had positioned himself in a carefully chosen foxhole that gave him the exact angle he needed to target the beam gap. The position was exposed, uncomfortable, and would be indefensible if the German spotted him. But it was the only location where the geometry worked. He loaded his Springfield with one of the precious armor-piercing rounds, settled his breathing, and began the longest wait of his military career. The shot window would open at approximately 0545 hours, when a rising sun would provide just enough contrast to make the steel beam visible for perhaps 10 or 12 minutes before the angle changed and the target disappeared back into shadow. He would get one chance, maybe two if he was extraordinarily lucky, before German machine gunners would triangulate his position and end the experiment permanently. Captain Hendricks had positioned himself 70 yards behind Kelleher's foxhole with a radio operator and a medical corpsman, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid being in the immediate kill zone when the Germans responded. He'd seen Kelleher's sketches and calculations but understood almost none of it. The plan looked like something a desperate man might attempt right before getting killed, which wasn't far from the truth. Hendricks had already written the after-action report in his mind, explaining how Corporal Kelleher had died attempting an unauthorized sniper technique that command would certainly criticize. But he'd also remembered the 3 snipers who'd already died following doctrine exactly, and sometimes desperate situations required desperate mathematics. The sun crept above the eastern ridgeline at 0543 hours, exactly when Kelleher's calculations had predicted. Light spilled across the hillside, painting the German observation post in shades of gray and brown that slowly resolved into distinct features. Kelleher controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate the way his instructors had taught him, watching through his scope as shadows shifted and details emerged. Then, at 0546 hours, he saw it. The narrow gap between concrete and steel beam, suddenly visible as morning light caught the metal surface at exactly the right angle. The gap looked impossibly small through his scope, a sliver of darkness behind a strip of rust-colored steel that could have been anything or nothing to eyes that hadn't spent 6 hours studying every detail of the bunker's construction. Kelleher made his final calculations in the 2 or 3 seconds his training allowed before overthinking destroyed instinct. Wind was nearly calm. Temperature effects were minimal at this range, and the beam surface appeared dry, which meant less unpredictability in the deflection angle. He placed his crosshairs on a spot approximately 2 inches left of the gap's visible edge, on the curved surface of the steel beam where the geometry said the deflection might work. The aiming point looked absurdly wrong to anyone trained in conventional marksmanship. He was deliberately shooting at a steel beam instead of at flesh, attempting to bounce a bullet into a target he couldn't actually see, using a technique that probably had no business being attempted by someone who wanted to survive the morning. His father's voice echoed in memory. "Angles don't lie, boy. People do. Trust the geometry." Kelleher pressed the trigger at 0547 hours. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder with familiar force, the crack of the rifle shot echoing across the frozen hillside and immediately giving away his position. Through his scope, Kelleher saw the bullet impact exactly where he'd aimed, striking the steel beam in a small shower of sparks and rust. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, from somewhere inside the bunker, there was a muffled sound that might have been a scream or might have been nothing at all. Kelleher didn't wait to confirm. German machine gun fire erupted from supporting positions 300 yards south, tracers arcing through the space where he'd been lying as he rolled sideways into deeper cover that he prepared hours earlier. Captain Hendricks watched through binoculars, expecting to see return fire from the observation post's firing slit, the usual immediate response to any sniper attempt. But the slit remained dark and silent. 10 seconds passed. 20, 30. No movement from the bunker. No muzzle flash. No German observer radiating coordinates for artillery strikes. Either Kelleher had missed completely and the Germans were waiting for a better target, or something remarkable had just happened. Hendricks keyed his radio and ordered a reconnaissance patrol forward, a decision that would either confirm an impossible success or collect another American corpse for the Graves registration unit. The patrol reached the observation post 45 minutes later, moving with the extreme caution of men who expect a machine gun fire at any moment. But the bunker remained silent. When Lieutenant Carl Morrison finally reached the firing slit and peered inside with a flashlight, he found something that would be discussed in whispered conversations across sniper units for the next 6 months. A German hauptmann lay dead behind the concrete wall, killed by a tumbling fragment of copper-jacketed steel core that had entered through the narrow gap between beam and concrete at a downward angle, striking him in the upper chest and severing his subclavian artery. The man had bled out in perhaps 90 seconds, alone in his fortified position, killed by a shot that shouldn't have been possible and that he'd probably never understood. The bunker contained detailed maps showing every American position along a 3-mile front, radio equipment for coordinating artillery, and a sniper's log recording 47 confirmed kills since October 28th. The German officer had been systematically destroying an entire regiment from this single position, and now he was gone, eliminated by geometry and desperation translated into a single armor-piercing bullet. Morrison's report reached Hendricks within the hour, and Hendricks faced an immediate decision that would shape how the military remembered or forgot James Kelleher's accomplishment. The technique violated multiple standing doctrines about acceptable sniper tactics. It couldn't be reliably replicated. The success rate would be abysmal, and teaching it widely might get more snipers killed than it saved. But it had worked, undeniably, and the German observation post that had paralyzed an entire division's supply corridor was now silent. Hendricks chose a middle path. He filed a report crediting Kelleher with eliminating a high-value target, but described the method vaguely as exploitation of structural weakness through precision fire, language that suggested conventional tactics rather than pool hall geometry. He recommended Kelleher for a Bronze Star, but said nothing about deflection angles or steel beams. The citation would read, well, protect Kelleher from criticism and avoid the bureaucratic nightmare of trying to explain why Army snipers should start bouncing bullets off hard surfaces like they were playing billiards with human lives. But word spread anyway, the way information always spreads among soldiers who respect results more than regulations. Within 2 weeks, snipers across the Hurtgen forest were studying fortified positions with new eyes, looking not for direct shots but for structural gaps, exposed beams, and deflection angles that might offer pathways through supposedly impenetrable defenses. A sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division used a similar technique to eliminate a German machine gun crew firing from a concrete pillbox, deflecting a round off an exposed doorframe hinge to strike the gunner from an angle he thought was protected. A corporal with the 9th Infantry found a way to bounce a bullet off frozen ground to strike up into a bunker's ventilation shaft, killing 2 Germans who believed they were completely safe. The techniques weren't reliable. Success rates remained below 15%, and several snipers died when their positions were exposed attempting shots that failed. But across November and December 1944, Allied forces quietly neutralized over 30 fortified observation posts using deflection techniques that trace their lineage back to a pool hall in South Boston and a corporal who'd learned to trust geometry over doctrine. Division intelligence officers noticed a pattern, but couldn't quite explain it. German positions that should have been secure were suddenly falling silent. Fortifications that require artillery strikes or frontal assaults were being eliminated by single rifle shots from impossible angles. The Germans noticed too. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a Wehrmacht intelligence analyst stationed in Düren, compiled reports from surviving observers who described Allied snipers using unorthodox angular fire that seemed to bend around cover and strike from directions that shouldn't have been possible. Weber's December 1944 report to Higher Command recommended immediate reinforcement of all observation posts with additional interior walls and elimination of any exposed structural elements, changes that cost the Germans valuable time and resources while reducing the effectiveness of their forward observation network. Weber never learned who had started the technique, never knew about a Boston pool shark turned Army sniper, but his report acknowledged that American forces had developed something genuinely new and operationally dangerous. Kelleher himself continued working through the winter, adding 16 more confirmed kills to his record before a mortar fragment wounded him in late January 1945. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but was severe enough to send him home, first to a hospital in England and then back to Boston, where he arrived in March to a neighborhood that had moved on from the war. His father's pool hall was gone. demolished for urban renewal, and the men who might have appreciated the geometry of his accomplishment were dead or scattered. Kelleher tried to explain the deflection shot once to a friend who asked about his Bronze Star, but describing pool table angles and bullet trajectories to someone who hadn't been there made him sound delusional or boastful. So he stopped trying. He took a job at the Charlestown Navy Yard doing maintenance work on mothballed destroyers, married a woman named Catherine who worked in the payroll office, and settled into a life that had nothing to do with angles, beams, or the geometry of death. The military forgot him almost immediately. His service record showed a Bronze Star and an honorable discharge, but the details of his observation post-elimination had been buried in vague language that protected doctrine more than preserved history. Sniper schools in the 1950s taught conventional techniques exclusively, and the deflection methods that spread to the Hurtgen Forest died out as the veterans who'd used them were replaced by a new generation trained in standardized procedures. By 1960, James Kelleher's name appeared nowhere in official sniper training materials, and the observation post-elimination was credited generally to 28th Infantry Division sniper operations, without individual attribution. But history has a way of resurfacing through unexpected channels, especially when researchers start digging through primary sources that bureaucracy forgot to classify. In 1987, Dr. Michael Brennan, a military historian researching sniper tactics in the European theater, discovered Captain Hendrick's original after-action report in a misfiled box at the National Archives. The report's deliberately vague language intrigued Brennan because it didn't match the straightforward descriptions in surrounding documents. He cross-referenced the date and location with German records captured after the war and found Hauptmann Weber's intelligence report about unorthodox angular fire, which included sketches of bullet trajectories that seemed physically improbable. Brennan spent the next 3 years tracking down surviving members of the 28th Infantry Division, interviewing elderly veterans whose memories were fading but who remembered stories about a corporal from Boston who could make bullets go around corners. He found James Kelleher in 1990, living in a Veterans Administration nursing home in Quincy, Massachusetts, suffering from advanced emphysema and largely forgotten by everyone except his daughter and a handful of old Navy Yard colleagues. Kelleher was 71 years old. His hands shook from decades of cigarette smoking, and he initially refused to discuss the war because he'd learned long ago that people didn't want to hear about geometry and deflection angles when they asked about heroism. But Brennan was persistent, and he brought evidence that Kelleher couldn't dismiss. The original after-action report, Weber's German intelligence analysis, and testimony from 3 surviving snipers who'd learned deflection techniques in late 1944 and credited them to some genius from Boston who played pool. Over 6 recorded interviews between March and August 1990. Kelleher finally explained his observation post-shot in detail. He drew diagrams showing the beam gap, calculated the deflection angle from memory, and described how his father had taught him to see the world as a series of geometric problems that always had solutions if you were willing to trust the mathematics. He explained how pool table combinations had translated into ballistic deflections, how studying light and shadow for 6 hours had revealed a narrow gap that everyone else had missed, and how that single shot had come from years of seeing angles that others couldn't perceive. Brennan recorded every word, took detailed notes, and recognized he discovered something rare, a genuine tactical innovation developed by a single soldier that had spread organically through combat units and been subsequently forgotten by official history. Brennan published his findings in 1992 in a military history journal article titled Deflection Geometry, Unconventional Sniper Tactics in the Hurtgen Forest, 1944. The article received modest attention in academic circles, but was largely ignored by mainstream military institutions because the techniques it described remained too unreliable for doctrinal adoption. However, certain special operations units took notice. By the mid-1990s, elite sniper schools were quietly experimenting with deflection shots as a last resort option for extremely specific scenarios where conventional tactics had failed. The techniques never entered official doctrine, but they survive in the oral traditions of communities that value creative problem-solving over rigid adherence to regulation. James Kelleher died in November 1991, 7 months before Brennan's article was published. He never knew that his observation post-shot would be studied by future generations of snipers, never learned that his pool hall geometry had quietly influenced tactics across 50 years, and never received the recognition that might have come of his technique had been properly documented when it mattered. His obituary in the Boston Globe ran 3 paragraphs and mentioned his Bronze Star, but said nothing about steel beams, deflection angles, or the German hauptman he'd killed from an impossible position on a frozen November morning. His daughter Catherine kept his Springfield rifle, his sniper notebook with its careful sketches and calculations, and his father's brass protractor, artifacts that meant nothing to most people but which represented a unique way of seeing the world that had saved hundreds of lives and then been forgotten. The German observation post in the Hurtgen Forest was demolished during post-war reconstruction, its concrete walls broken up, and its steel beams salvaged with scrap metal that probably ended up in buildings or bridges across a recovering Europe. No marker indicates where it stood or commemorates the 47 American soldiers it killed before Corporal Kelleher ended its effectiveness with a single improbable bullet. The hillside is now part of a memorial forest, peaceful and quiet, visited by tourists who walk the trails without knowing the geometry of death that once played out beneath their feet. Captain Robert Hendricks survived the war, retired as a colonel in 1962, and never spoke publicly about the decision to send Kelleher after the observation post or the vague language he'd used in his after-action report to protect an unconventional tactic from bureaucratic criticism. In a private letter to Brennan in 1989, Hendricks admitted he'd known the deflection shot was a pool hall trick translated into military necessity, and he deliberately obscured the details because he believed the Army wasn't ready to acknowledge that sometimes the best solutions came from Boston pool sharks who understood geometry better than West Point graduates understood doctrine. He defended his decision, noting that Kelleher's Bronze Star was real recognition even if the citation didn't capture the full truth, and that protecting unconventional thinking was sometimes more important than celebrating it. Hendricks died in 1993. Satisfied that he'd done right by a corporal who'd saved an entire regiment by seeing angles no one else could perceive. Modern military historians remain divided on the deflection shot's significance. Conservative analysts argue it was a lucky accident that shouldn't be celebrated because it might encourage dangerous deviation from proven tactics. Progressive researchers counter that tactical innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that Kelleher's approach represented exactly the kind of adaptive problem-solving that distinguishes effective soldiers from those who follow doctrine into failure. What's undeniable is that between November 1944 and January 1945, Allied snipers using deflection techniques eliminated approximately 127 fortified German positions that conventional methods had failed to neutralize, resulting in estimated casualties avoided numbering in the hundreds. Whether those successes justified the risks taken by snipers attempting impossible shots remains a question without consensus. The most lasting impact of Kelleher's observation post shot may be philosophical rather than tactical. His story challenges the assumption that military effectiveness requires strict adherence to doctrine developed by institutional authorities. Sometimes the ordinary enlisted man with unconventional skills and the willingness to think outside regulatory constraints can solve problems that baffle commanders and staff officers. The Army teaches this principle in leadership courses, but rarely acknowledges specific examples where it actually happened, perhaps because celebrating deviation from doctrine creates uncomfortable questions about whose knowledge really matters and whose gets written into the official manuals. In 2003, a small group of military historians and Special Forces veterans raised funds to place a memorial plaque at the Veterans Administration nursing home where Kelleher died, commemorating his service, and specifically mentioning the observation post elimination. The plaque includes his father's phrase, "Angles don't lie, boy. People do." A small recognition that the geometry lessons learned in the South Boston Pool Hall had traveled across an ocean and saved lives in ways that Thomas Kelleher never could have imagined. The ceremony was quiet, attended by perhaps 30 people, and received no media coverage. But for those present, it represented an acknowledgement that history sometimes forgets its most interesting characters, and that the distance between a pool table and a battlefield might be smaller than official doctrine wants to admit. Jimmy Kelleher never claimed to be a hero, never sought recognition beyond the Bronze Star Captain Hendricks secured for him, and never believed his deflection shot was anything more than geometry applied to an immediate problem. He would have been puzzled by historians debating his tactical innovation, and probably embarrassed by suggestions that he'd changed sniper doctrine. In his own mind, he'd simply seen an angle that others had missed, trusted the mathematics his father had taught him, and taken a shot that either would work or wouldn't. The fact that it did work, that it saved lives and quietly influenced tactics across months of brutal combat, was satisfying but not surprising. Angles didn't lie. People did. And when you trusted the geometry completely, sometimes the impossible became merely difficult. And the difficult became a single bullet traveling 478 yards to strike a steel beam at exactly the right angle to change everything. The observation post fell silent at 0547 hours on November 14, 1944. The German hauptmann died confused and alone. The supply road reopened. The regiment moved forward. And somewhere in the frozen mud of the Hurtgen Forest, a pool shark from Boston smiled briefly before rolling into deeper cover, knowing that his father would have been proud of the shot, even if no one else would ever fully understand the geometry that made it possible. History might forget the details, might bury the truth in vague citations and bureaucratic language, might let decades pass before someone bothered to ask how it really happened. But the angles remained true, preserved in fading notebooks and whispered stories, waiting for anyone curious enough to calculate the trajectory and discover that sometimes the impossible shot is just a problem in geometry that no one else has bothered to solve.